Hey, this is Miss D, and in this presentation, we're going to talk about the rise of nativism in the 1920s. Again, another review. When people think in the 1920s, they think of the roaring 20s, they think of these wild times with people partying and the flappers and the speakeasies. But again, this is an era, it's also an era where these kinds of fast-paced changes in the culture, a lot of people found them very threatening. So it was not all kind of partying and drinking and all of that. There were other serious issues going on because this is, again, there's a lot of cultural conflict. One of the big issues in the 1920s is, and there's a big rise in unemployment. What happens is at the end of the war, you have all of these returning soldiers, and now they all need their jobs, right? So what happens is some returning veterans can't find work. If they did find work, then that means the people who used to have the jobs get fired to make way for the soldiers. And what you tend to see, and this is you tend to see this just regardless of the period. We've seen this over and over in U.S. history, is that generally when you see when there's more kind of economic insecurity, when people feel like there's not enough jobs, they're not making enough money, you also tend to see a rise in anti-immigrant feelings that this the stereotypical, hey, you're immigrants, you're stealing jobs from real Americans, right? You tend to see a rise in those kinds of fears because people are uncomfortable, they're nervous, they can't make a living, that there's economic problems, and they want to find a bad guy. And this is what's going on in the 1920s. We've seen this before, right? Remember in the Industrial Revolution, there were all these immigrants coming in, and people said, oh, the immigrants are stealing jobs from Americans. Well, we see that same thing coming up in the 1920s. This time around, people do not see the unions as the good guys. Remember, at the end of World War One, unions were seen and kind of perceived as being un-American, that they were associated with radicals who were, communists and anarchists. And so you don't see the rise in people don't see unions as like protecting workers' rights or things like that. They're actually seen as un-American. So membership in unions falls. Again, so like I said, just to review what nativism means, nativism is this idea that the culture, that society should favor native born Americans. And remember, when I say natives, I don't mean American Indians. I don't mean Native Americans. When they talk about natives in the context of nativism, they're talking about that first group of immigrants, right? These white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, these white Europeans from Northern Europe, those are the true Americans, right? Those are the kinds of people who wrote the Constitution and who settled the U.S. and things like that. Those are these kind of original colonists and their descendants. Those are the true Americans, right? And everybody who came after is viewed with suspicion, that they are un-American, that they're not. And again, as you can see from the cartoon, we can't digest the scum that these new terrible people who are coming into America, they're going to ruin our culture. They're going to ruin our country. Again, little review. In the last presentation, I talked about the African American experience. And we talked a little bit about how in the 1920s, we start to see a resurgence of the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was very big after the end of the Civil War during Reconstruction. Well, they come back in the 1920s. And in fact, the 1920s is when the Klan was at its most popular. It had its largest membership. And as I explained to you, it was very socially acceptable to be a member of the Klan. And a lot of people gravitated to the organization because it portrayed itself as protecting small town American values. This idea of white Christian culture needed to be protected. And so, not just from African Americans, but also the group was very much anti-immigrant, right? So, and again, this kind of, again, they kind of exploit this fear of immigrants. So it has a lot of resonance and a lot of popularity during this era. So again, this feeling that we have to have fear for anything that is un-American, that is not American. And this really gets triggered. This kind of coincides with what's happening in Russia. You may remember, for those of you who had global, this is a review. For those of you who are taking Global 10 next year, keep this in mind, because this is something you're going to learn about, and this is something important to know, is that in World War One, Russia was on the side of the Allies. So it fought alongside England and France against Germany, okay? What happens is Russia had been ruled by a czar, which is basically a king, and this czar is overthrown. Okay, fighting World War One leads to widespread starvation. A lot of people are killed in the war. They have a really high body count from Russia, and what ends up happening is the government is overthrown. And later, there's like a temporary government that kind of moves in, but really that same year, you have the Bolshevik Revolution. It's led by Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin promises the peasants peace, land, and bread. Okay, he promises the Russian people, we're going to stop fighting World War One. So I'm going to give you peace. I'm going to take land away from the very rich lords, and I'm going to distribute it to the peasants, and bread. You will no longer starve. And this is a message that's very, very popular and leads to the first communist government, right? This Bolsheviks take over Russia. Well, in the United States, when they see the Bolsheviks take over Russia, this is greeted with huge fear. Okay, this is huge fear. So this fear of communists, that the communists have taken over Russia, could America be next? And this is a very, very scary time. Okay, and they view this as a threat. So one of the ways that we start to see in this 1920s era is this push to protect American culture. Is this, what we start to see is a limit being put on immigration, okay? Now, if you remember in the turn of the century when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, literally when we showed, you remember I showed you a video of people coming through Ellis Island. I mean, as long as you weren't bringing like some major disease, as long as you had a pulse and you made it in, you were good to go. There were no limits. There was a ton of immigrants that came in, and they were welcomed with open arms. Because remember, American businesses needed their labor. So there were no limits. You made it to Ellis Island, you were good to go. We start to see limits put on immigration in the 1920s. And what they use is what's called a quota. A quota is a numerical, just basically a numbers game, where once you reach a certain quota, once you reach a certain number, doors are closed. So as you can see, there's like a gate. So all these Europeans, you can see the funnel, right? All these Europeans, they all want to come to America, and they all fill the funnel. And what does Uncle Sam do? Once he reaches 3%, boop, doors shut. You cannot come in. And this is the first time we're going to start seeing quotas being used to limit immigration. And again, the idea is we need to, we see it, the driver of this is nativism, that people are scared that immigrants are going to ruin American culture. So again, it's a limit placed on how many immigrants from each country could enter the United States every year. Now, what gets tricky is certain countries had more limits than others, okay? So what you see is in the Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924, they specifically limit, not everybody, they're going to be focused on limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So they specifically don't want Southerners, so like Southern Europeans are like your Italians, and they don't want Eastern Europeans. It's a lot of Jews and things like that. So again, they get rid of the Roman Catholics, get rid of the Jews. They want to retain America as being a white a Christian country. So we're a Protestant country, not a Catholic country. And these quotas basically make it so that Asians can no longer come to America. That's the goal, is to keep Chinese and Japanese people out of America. All right. And these limits stay in place until the 1960s. If you take a look at this map, you see the blue line, right? That's the only one that's really high. Europeans are still okay. If you're a Northern European, the doors are open to you. But as you can see, other groups like Asians, which is the red line, that's going to stay very, very low. They do not want people from China, from Japan, from other parts of East Asia. They want to keep them out. They're going to keep out Spanish people from South America. Africans are kept out. Oceania refers to like Australia and that area, like New Zealand. So it's kind of the push is to keep them out of the U.S. And again, as I said earlier, one of the big issues driving this nativism, in addition to kind of protecting U.S. culture, is this idea that we need to protect America from communism. Again, like I said, the Bolsheviks had overthrown the government of Russia and formed the USSR, and there is this huge fear that they will do the same thing in America. And so this is known as the first Red Scare. Why is it the first Red Scare? Because there's going to be another one. Okay, so the first Red Scare takes place in the 1920s with the Russian Revolution. There's going to be one later in the 1950s, and that's going to coincide with the start of the Cold War. So that's in the post-World War II era. In the post-World War II era, there's going to be another Red Scare. So we're looking right now at the first Red Scare, the first of two Red Scares. And like I said, the first Red Scare follows the Russian Revolution, and they introduced the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, and they're specifically targeting anybody who is a radical, or if you call yourself a communist, they're coming after you. And you can see in this political cartoon, the fear of communists is maybe the fly, and what are they going to use to kill the fly? They use this hammer of the Sedition Act. And you remember this really severe limitations on free speech and association and all these other rights you have in the Bill of Rights. They're going to take away your freedoms to protect you from these communists. And this political cartoon is saying, dude, it's overkill. Take away that much freedom to protect us from something that's really not that big of an issue. So that's at least the view of this cartoonist. What happens is what you should be aware of is in the 1920s, you have something known as the Palmer Raids. And the Palmer Raids are really scary. This was a time where people from the Justice Department, if they heard you were a communist or socialist or an anarchist, they could come after you, and you would be, they would just be arrested, you would be thrown out of the country, what have you. Now, just to be clear, if I tell you, yeah, I'm a communist, are you allowed to put me in jail? Are you allowed to throw me out and say, okay, well, commie, you don't belong here, I'm going to send you off to Russia? That's not allowed. I can be part of any political organization I want, even if I want to be a socialist, even if I want to be a communist. That's your right as an American. Now, don't get it twisted. If you say I'm a communist, I'm a socialist, and therefore I want to overthrow the government violently, or I'm going to give state secrets to Vladimir Putin, that's a different story. Now you've crossed the line, okay? It's one thing to believe in it. It's another thing to act on it. You get what I'm saying? But this is the idea that back then in the 1920s, they did not make that distinction. If you were identified as a communist, you were viewed as a threat. And this is with the Palmer Raids actually get their name from Palmer, who was the attorney, and his assistant is J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover is going to be the man who's going to start the FBI. So J. Edgar Hoover has a pretty he has a pretty checkered past when it comes to respecting people's civil rights. He needs to protect America no matter what. So his name will come up again. But like I said, these Palmer Raids were designed to target and find communists, anarchists, socialists, identify them and get them the hell out of the country. And if they have to trample your civil rights to do it, too bad. The big example of this rise of nativism and the toll it takes on civil rights, usually most people point to the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. Sacco and Vanzetti, these were two Italians. I don't know if you know they're Italian. The stereotype is that Italian last name usually ends in an vowel. But my last name has no vowel, and I'm half Italian, but well, whatever. Anyway, Sacco and Vanzetti, these are two Italian guys, all right? And what happens is they are arrested for robbery and murder. The problem is there's very little evidence that they did it. However, they were identified and admitted that they were anarchists. They said, look, I'm an anarchist, but I didn't kill that guy. I didn't commit the murder. And even though there's very, very little evidence, they are still convicted of the crime. They are convicted and they are executed. They get the death penalty. And a lot of people were convinced that Sacco and Vanzetti, the only reason that they were killed, the only reason they went down for this crime was because they were anarchists. There was not enough evidence to convict them of this murder. And so this is kind of one of those eras where, kind of the proof of how bad nativism is. The Sacco and Vanzetti trial, the conviction of these two Italian immigrants who were admitted anarchists, the fact that they were killed by the government, people look at this and say, listen, you killed them because they were Italians and they were anarchists. They didn't commit a crime. Okay. All right. And with that, we are done.